The dawn broke over the Potomac, not with the usual rhythm of bureaucratic posturing, but with a tectonic shift in the global order. At exactly 6:47 a.m. EST, a courier arrived at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., delivering a diplomatic note that would effectively serve as the opening salvo in a new era of international relations. This was no mere letter of concern or a polite suggestion for dialogue. It was a hardened, legally binding commitment to synchronize geopolitical action. Signed by the ambassadors of 40 nations, the document represented a total rejection of unilateral American pressure. It established a unified front, declaring that if the United States government failed to meet the specific requirements of Canada's March 18th deadline, the world's most powerful economies would move in lockstep to insulate Canada and isolate the US. By the time the sun was fully up, the special relationship and decades of traditional alliances had been replaced by a singular coordinated ultimatum. The sheer scale of this coalition is a logistical marvel that has left the State Department in a state of visible paralysis. The list of signatories reads like a roll call of the modern developed world, spanning every habitable continent, from the historic corridors of power in London, Paris, and Berlin, to the high-tech hubs of Tokyo, Seoul, and Singapore. The message was uniform. The entire 27-member European Union, alongside Norway, Switzerland, Australia, and New Zealand, stood shoulder to shoulder with Canada. Perhaps more shocking to American intelligence was the inclusion of major powers across Latin America and Africa, regions that have historically been forced to choose between Washington and its rivals, but who have now found a third way. This is a coalition of the willing, unlike any seen in history, representing a total departure from the post-Cold War status quo. To view this as a symbolic gesture of diplomatic solidarity would be a catastrophic miscalculation. This is a cold, hard mathematical reality. These 40 nations represent over 60% of the global GDP and more than 50% of all international trade. By formally aligning themselves with Ottawa, they have constructed a global economic wall that the United States cannot simply bypass or ignore. For the first time since the founding of the United Nations in 1945, American hegemony is not being challenged by a single great power rival like Russia or China, but by a collective of its own closest allies and most essential trading partners. The United States now finds itself on the outside of a system it helped build, facing a world that has decided it is no longer willing to accept the volatility of a might-makes-right approach to international diplomacy. The speed of this transformation is perhaps the most unnerving aspect for the White House. The architect of this lightning-fast alliance, Mark Carney, managed to assemble this global phalanx in less than 24 hours following his parliamentary address. Carney leveraged his unique standing as a former central banker to both Canada and the UK to speak the language of sovereign risk, convincing world leaders that a threat to Canadian sovereignty was a threat to the stability of the entire rules-based order. As the West Wing began its morning briefings, the reality set in. The United States is no longer engaged in a manageable bilateral dispute with its northern neighbor. It is facing a coordinated global rebellion. The nation's most vital security partners and largest export markets have essentially declared that they will choose the principle of sovereign equality over their loyalty to Washington, leaving the US in a state of geopolitical isolation that was unthinkable just a day ago. The diplomatic note delivered to the State Department is not merely a list of grievances. It is a blueprint for the systematic deconstruction of American economic and diplomatic leverage. The document outlines 4 lethal coordinated measures designed to trigger with surgical precision at precisely 9 a.m. on March 18th. The first pillar centers on preferential trade for Canada, a move that effectively re-engineers the global marketplace to the detriment of US industry. By granting Canada most favored nation status simultaneously across 40 jurisdictions, this coalition will slash tariffs to near zero and implement Green Channel expedited customs processing for all Canadian exports. This creates a mirrored reality where a Canadian tech firm or manufacturer can move products into Europe, Asia, and Latin America with significantly lower overhead and faster delivery times than their American competitors. By stripping away the US competitive edge, the coalition is essentially building a global trade bypass that treats the United States as a high-tariff, high-friction zone, while Canada becomes the world's preferred merchant. The second pillar strikes at the very heart of North American continental stability, energy diversification. For decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that Canada is a captive energy supplier due to geography and existing pipeline infrastructure. That leverage has vanished overnight. The coalition of European and Asian nations has committed to $180 billion in annual, long-term purchase agreements for Canadian crude, natural gas and electricity. By offering premium prices that exceed current US market rates, these nations have provided the Canadian energy sector with the capital and the incentive to aggressively pivot away from the American market. This is a massive blow to US energy security. It signals that Canada no longer needs the United States to maintain its status as an energy superpower. Instead, Canada has found a global clientele willing to pay for the privilege of securing a stable supply, leaving American refineries and utilities to face the prospect of dwindling reserves and skyrocketing costs as Canada's resources flow across the oceans rather than across the border. The third pillar, the financial backstop, is perhaps the most sophisticated element of Carney's strategy, designed specifically to neutralize the nuclear option of American financial sanctions. To ensure Canada cannot be starved of capital, all 40 signatory nations have agreed to accept the Canadian dollar for bilateral trade and have established a massive, interlocking network of currency swap agreements. This creates a $15 trillion financial safety net, effectively making the Canadian economy unsinkable by any unilateral move from the US Treasury. If the United States attempts to freeze Canadian assets or restrict access to the SWIFT banking system, this global coalition will provide the necessary liquidity to stabilize Canadian markets and maintain its purchasing power. By backing the Canadian dollar with the combined weight of the world's largest central banks, Carney has ensured that the almighty dollar in Washington no longer holds a monopoly on North American financial survival. The final pillar is the total diplomatic isolation of the United States, a move intended to turn Washington into a pariah capital until the dispute is resolved. If the March 18th deadline passes without compliance, the 40 nations will immediately downgrade their diplomatic engagements with the White House. This is not just about recalled ambassadors, it is a full-scale freeze on the machinery of international cooperation. Planned bilateral summits will be cancelled, trade missions will be grounded, and high-level security dialogues will be shuttered. Most critically, these nations have pledged to coordinate their votes and positions within international bodies like the G20, the IMF and the United Nations to systematically block any US-led initiatives. This coordinated blockade ensures that no matter how much military or economic power the United States possesses, it will find itself shouting into a void in the halls of global governance, unable to advance its interests until it returns to the negotiating table with Canada on the coalition's terms. The speed and precision of Mark Carney's diplomatic blitzkrieg have left veteran Washington strategists reeling, wondering how a single leader could dismantle decades of American bilateral leverage in a single afternoon. According to high-level diplomatic sources, Carney's approach was a masterclass in high-stakes negotiation. He didn't approach world leaders as a petitioner begging for a favor, but as a peer offering a strategic ultimatum of his own. He framed the escalating crisis between Ottawa and Washington not as a local border dispute, but as a definitive test of global sovereignty. His logic was as cold as it was compelling. If the United States under its current administration could successfully use economic coercion to break a country as integrated and stable as Canada, then no nation, regardless of its wealth or alliance status, would ever be safe from similar bullying again. He presented a binary choice: either stand with Canada now to establish the principle that international law matters, or stay silent and accept a world where might makes right is the only remaining rule. The dominoes fell with astonishing speed, starting with the European Union. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reportedly saw in Carney's proposition a long-awaited opportunity to assert Europe's strategic autonomy. By joining first, the EU signaled that its commitment to the rules-based international order was not just rhetorical, it was a line in the sand. For Brussels, supporting Canada was a defensive maneuver to prevent a precedent where a larger power could unilaterally rewrite trade and energy agreements. The United Kingdom followed suit almost immediately, with Prime Minister Keir Starmer reinforcing the move by citing the deep-rooted bilateral defence and intelligence frameworks that bind London and Ottawa. For the UK, the decision was a pivot back toward its Commonwealth roots and a declaration that the special relationship with Washington would not come at the cost of abandoning its most reliable, democratic partners. The coalition gained unstoppable momentum as it moved into the Indo-Pacific. Japan and South Korea, both of whom have grown increasingly weary of the White House's transactional and often unpredictable approach to security alliances, saw Carney's alliance as a vehicle for mutual respect. For Tokyo and Seoul, joining the 40-nation front was a calculated move to transition from being treated as subordinate security dependents to being recognized as equal strategic partners who could collectively check American volatility. This sentiment resonated deeply across the global South as well. Latin American nations like Mexico, Brazil, and Chile, long accustomed to the weight of U.S. economic pressure, viewed Canada's resistance as a historic blueprint for asserting their own resource sovereignty. Similarly, African nations joined the fold because they recognized in Canada's struggle a familiar fight against resource extraction and coercive diplomacy. By the time the clock struck midnight, the geopolitical math had been irrevocably settled. Carney had successfully synthesized the grievances of the developed and developing worlds into a single unified strike force. He hadn't just built a coalition, he had effectively created a shadow global order that excluded the United States. While the White House was still preparing its morning talking points, Carney had already secured the signatures of 40 nations, representing a combined economic and diplomatic weight that no single administration, no matter how defiant, could hope to counter. The result was a stunning reversal of roles. The United States, which had long used the threat of isolation to get its way, woke up to find that it was the one standing alone against a world that had finally decided to move on without it. The atmosphere within the White House this morning is being described by stunned staffers as one of total geopolitical vertigo. For an administration that has long prided itself on its ability to dictate terms to the world, the sudden realization that the United States is now the one being dictated to has triggered a level of internal chaos unseen in decades. Senior aides have reportedly compared the current sense of isolation to the dark early days of the Revolutionary War, noting that for the first time in over a century, the US finds itself without a single major ally willing to defend its position. When President Trump was first briefed on the diplomatic note at 9:30 a.m., his initial reaction was one of characteristic disbelief. He reportedly dismissed the 40-nation coalition as a monumental bluff designed to scare him into a bad deal. However, the air in the Oval Office curdled when National Security Council officials clarified that this was not a threat for the future, it was a reality already in motion. They informed him that the European Union and Japan had already begun the technical process of activating their Green Channel trade protocols for Canadian goods, proving that Carney's alliance was fully operational before the ink on the note was even dry. In the hallways of the West Wing, the initial defiance has rapidly devolved into a frantic search for a counter-strategy that simply does not exist. The administration's official public statement was predictably combative, labeling the coordinated move inappropriate and unprecedented interference in a bilateral matter. Yet beneath that thin veneer of strength, the silence emanating from the State Department has been deafening. Career diplomats and top-tier strategists have reportedly told the president's inner circle that the traditional American toolkit, tariffs, secondary sanctions, and diplomatic threats is useless when applied to 40 nations simultaneously. You cannot sanction half the world's GDP without triggering a domestic economic collapse that would dwarf the Great Recession. The realization that the United States has been diplomatically outmaneuvered and physically boxed in has left the administration's America First policy facing its first true existential crisis, a world that has decided to put America last. The shockwaves have traveled instantly across Pennsylvania Avenue, where the reaction on Capitol Hill has been one of bipartisan panic. In a rare moment of unified alarm, leaders from both sides of the aisle have signaled that the nation is facing a national emergency of the highest order. Senate Majority Leader John Thune and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer have both issued statements that reflect a terrifying consensus. The United States is currently losing its status as a global leader in real time. Even the president's most reliable defenders in the Senate have begun to break ranks. Senator Lindsey Graham, typically a vocal supporter of the administration's foreign policy, told reporters that standing firm is one thing, but standing alone against 40 of our best friends is suicide. The prevailing sentiment among lawmakers is that the US has been caught in a Carney trap, a perfectly executed diplomatic pincer movement that has left the country with no choice but to either meet Canada's demands or preside over the rapid dismantling of American global influence. The geopolitical chessboard has been reduced to a binary of high-stakes consequences, with each path leading toward a fundamental reimagining of American power. The first potential outcome is forced capitulation, a scenario where the sheer gravity of economic and domestic pressure snaps the administration's resolve before the March 18th deadline. In this version of events, the United States is forced to watch as its domestic markets hemorrhage value, fueled by the realization that 40 of its largest trading partners are prepared to pivot away simultaneously. As energy prices spike, and major industry leaders from Silicon Valley to the Rust Belt demand an end to the isolation, the White House may be forced to announce a full retreat by March 15th. While such a move would stave off an immediate global trade war and stabilize the immediate supply chain crisis, the long-term strategic damage would be irreversible. The world would have successfully tested and proven a playbook for breaking American will through collective action. The aura of US invincibility would be shattered, replaced by the knowledge that a coordinated coalition of mid-sized powers can effectively veto any American policy they deem coercive. This would mark the end of the era where Washington could act unilaterally without fear of a unified global pushback. The second, and perhaps more radical outcome, is the emergence of a new multipolar order, triggered by a flat refusal from the US to meet Carney's demands. Should the March 18th deadline pass without compliance, the world will effectively begin the process of unplugging from the American-centric system. This would not be a slow drift, but a structural rupture. Global trade routes would be aggressively re-engineered to bypass US ports. Financial transactions would increasingly migrate to the $15 trillion safety net established by the coalition, and Canada would become the new hub for a rules-based trade bloc that excludes Washington. In this scenario, the American century officially concludes, not with a bang, but with a diplomatic and economic bypass. US influence would rapidly shrink from a global reach to a purely regional scope, leaving the nation as a powerful but isolated island in a world that has learned to coordinate its own security, energy, and financial stability without American oversight. The vacuum left by US leadership would not be filled by a single rival like China, but by a sophisticated, decentralized network of allies who have decided that their collective sovereignty is more valuable than their alignment with the United States.